Hi, this is Brennan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and I'm here with Deathblade, and we are going to be talking about sort of the role that research plays when you're creating things for wuxia and shansha and any kind of writing really, but in particular those genres. I don't know. I guess to start off, you've been working on, or you just sort of finished Legends of Ogre. So what kind of research toward the end were you finding helpful for that process?
Well, I think Legends of Overgate is was more difficult than the average story might have been because it was an attempt to reflect a certain period of time in Chinese history. And so the game universe you created, the world of Xixian is based on historical China. And I think the modern day setting of the world is Song Dynasty China, right?
Yeah, it's Song. Yeah, I mean it's not
Right.
actual Song, but it's like not
Analogous.
Song Dynasty China. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but I was writing 1,000 years before that, and so mine was more of a reflection of like around the Han Dynasty. And so, even me going into it, I was just thinking, oh, all right, it's ancient China, whatever. I've seen a lot of kung fu movies, so that's probably easy to do. But no, it's not as easy to do if you're trying to make it at least an accurate or semi-accurate reflection. And actually, what really brought that home to me was when you pointed out to me that I had the characters in a scene sitting down at chairs around a desk, and you pointed out, or maybe it was a table eating food or something, and you pointed out to me that chairs didn't really exist in the time period in China that I was, attempting to reflect, or if they did, they had just been recently introduced and weren't commonly used, especially in things like restaurants and stuff like that. And that was when it was actually that moment where I was like, all of a sudden it struck me, wow, I need to, do a little bit more research into what I'm writing because yeah, the Han Dynasty was a really, really, really long time ago. And so if I'm going to write in a world that's analogous to that, I can't just, make stuff up. And so from that point on, anytime I encountered anything from a type of food that they were eating to, what kind of clothing they might be wearing or what kind of weapons they might be using. Obviously, it's a fictional world, but I tried to do my best to make it reflect what it would have been like in that time period in China.
Do you find that I mean you live in China and you speak Chinese, so do you find that those are useful tools for you? Like is that like because one of the things that I encounter when I'm trying to look things up is like I'll try to look up like armor or something, right? Like on the internet if I don't have a book, say. And I'll inevitably come upon a page of material that looks incredible, but it's all Chinese characters describing and so I think, oh wow, if I only knew Chinese, I could crack open this code on this page. So you must have all these opportunities to learn, or I don't know, maybe you just find it more overwhelming because now there's like, 4 times as much material for you to go over.
It's a little bit of both, I'd say. I mean, it's definitely overwhelming, and I'm getting better as the years go by at reading Chinese, but I'm obviously nowhere near my English reading level. And as you can imagine, if you're trying to look up information on armor, you can pull up an article and you can kind of scan it pretty quickly and decide, okay, this is what I'm looking for, and then read it more closely, or just be like, oh, this is a waste of time. But I can't really scan stuff in Chinese. Not and get the main points of the article and then go back to read it. I have to actually read it from the beginning, and so that makes it very difficult. And so I don't tend to do that. I tend to if it goes beyond a certain point where I'm not certain right away that the information is relevant and it's what I want, then I have to like ask my wife to do it for me because she's Chinese, so I can be like, hey, can you do this? And the thing is, she doesn't like, she's not interested in history. She likes, like makeup and things like that. So she does not like, researching ancient Chinese.
You're
For example, one of the things that came up, because this is something from the Wandering Heroes of Ogre setting, is the ward system in the cities and how they would have, people in charge of certain sections of the city, but they were separate from the military and separate from the police. And you had asked me about it, and I was curious about it, and I forced her to like sit down and read this really long article. But forcing her to sit down and read the article doesn't work very often. So to answer the question, it does help. I can look up articles, and that it does help a lot. Many, many times, the information that you can find about certain stuff is more readily available. And I'll give you another example, and this doesn't come from Ogre stuff. It comes from a different thing, which was my father-in-law. So he's Chinese. He sent, and he doesn't really speak English. He sent me this link to like Chinese culture things that foreigners should know. And I knew like 99 out of 100 of the things that were on that list, but there was one thing that struck me, and it was a kind of a weapon called a tong saber, I think. And the reason it stuck out to me was because first of all, I'd never heard of it, and second of all, the picture looked weird to me. And as I did my research, I found out that the picture associated with that article, which was in Chinese, was incorrect. But in order to find out the information about this tong saber, I couldn't find anything in the of course, I was out and about. I wasn't at home, but I was on my phone, like looking up Wikipedia articles and searching on Google and stuff. I couldn't find any information about it, so I had to go look up the information in Chinese. So there's definitely a lot of stuff out there that you don't have access to unless you can look at it in the original language.
Yeah, I've definitely come across pages on clothing and stuff where there will be like images of the clothing, and like it won't be a lot of Chinese, but there'll be just enough that it'll just be like explaining what this portion of the gown is, or what period it's from, and so those are the ones that always end up frustrating me when I see them, because they look like they'd be really useful. But I don't know. One of my problems, it's not a problem, but one of the things that sort of is frustrating for me is when you're working on something that's related to history, you obviously can't just make up whatever you want. I mean, you can, but every time you do that, you feel compelled to sort of check it against the history sometimes, and so you end up in these situations where to get like a tiny bit of text, you have to do a lot of research. It's like that one little paragraph that took you 3 books to get. Like I remember one time I don't know, I wanted to know about how markets worked or something, and I just needed this one little description in a module, and I think I had to read 2 books just to get the information in like that one little tiny section. And so I don't know, like, do you find that to be the case when you're?
So, yeah, definitely. I mean, whether it was in Legends of Ogre, for Legends of Ogre, I mean, like I already said, well, when I went into it, I was trying to like emulate the Chinese web novel sort of like format, structure, and practice, where it's putting out a high volume of chapters relatively quickly. And it didn't take long before I abandoned that because I wanted it to be better writing and more accurate in terms of the historical stuff. And so then every single little thing that came up, I would have to stop. So the chapters took me a lot longer to write, and exactly like you. And actually, this came from you as well, because I remember in one of the early chapters of Ogre, I had the characters eating something. I don't remember what it was. It was like string beans or something. And you asked me, you were like, had that been introduced into China at this point in history? And I was like, dang, I didn't even think about that. And so from then on, any little thing that I had them eat or drink, I would look up. And for example, you have sorghum wine in your game universe, and from very early on, I had them drinking that, and then I was thinking, wait a second, when was that introduced into China? And so I ended up doing a whole video on that on my YouTube channel about alcohol when it was introduced. And thankfully, I think I'm safe to say that it could exist at that time period. In terms of my YouTube channel, it's the same thing. I try to keep those YouTube videos to be like about 10 minutes, and some of them go into the 15 or 20 minute range, which I try to keep it a little bit shorter than that. But same thing. My original idea for that YouTube channel was to answer the questions that I see all the time in the comments of the novels. And I was thinking, well, I already know the answers to the questions, so it should be really easy, right? I just turn on the video, like talk for a couple minutes, answer the question, it'll be done. 3 or 4 minutes. And then I very quickly realized that other than a few obvious topics that I didn't need to do research about, a lot of that stuff I didn't feel comfortable putting myself, in the position of somebody who at least kind of knows what they're talking about without doing research. So the clothes video, I don't remember, we were talking about this earlier before we started recording, but I did a video about the kind of clothing that they would wear in these kind of settings. And that was another thing where I thought I would just, kind of talk for a couple minutes. And then I ended up doing hours and hours of research just to do a 15 or 20 minute video. And then I had to search for the images. And so, yeah, it's kind of like a rabbit hole. Once you go down, it's hard to climb back out until you reach the bottom.
No, that was one of the more interesting videos. I want to watch it again because I was listening to it in my car, and so I didn't. Sorry about that. I didn't see the. I didn't actually see most of the video. I just got to listen to most of it. So.
Oh yeah, I got a lot of pictures in there, so you got to check that out.
Yeah, that's well, I saw some of it. Like I pulled over at a certain point and started looking at it, but I would definitely recommend the video because even just the informational content I thought was, really really good.
Have you ever run across a situation where like either you were like mind blown by some tidbit that you found in your research, or maybe was there ever any time when you in doing your research all of a sudden realized you had made a mistake in your previous assumptions or something along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of specific times, but I know that's happened to me a lot. Like both of those things. I think the thing that always kind of gets me is when I see like technology that like I didn't realize could have existed at a point in time that it did, or an institution that's like really advanced, and you're like, oh wow, they had that at this time. Those kind of things are the ones that always impress me the most. And the errors are, I mean, unless you like know everything, you're gonna make mistakes. Also, I think the way I look at it, I think that there are. So number one, it's a fantasy world. So certain mistakes or differences from the real world could be fine. Like the food example, we could have just decreed, okay, well, potatoes weren't here at this time, but darn it, they're gonna have potatoes. It's just different, Chixian has potatoes, but I think. Oh, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But I think that. Oh no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah. I mean, you were going along with it's a fantasy world, which is definitely true. And for example, one big difference is that in CCM there is only one continent, and in the real world there are more than one. There is more than one continent. There are many continents, I guess you could say. So for example, like in this comes up with spicy food because I have spicy food come up fairly early on in Legends of Ogre Gate, which hot peppers didn't get introduced into China until way later. But I'm pretty sure a lot of that would be because of the fact that they came from a different continent, as opposed to Xi'an is all in one big continent. So I think that leaves a lot more room to explain why certain technologies or certain foods or whatever would show up when they might not have in China.
Yeah, and it's a square-shaped continent, so it's a very practically. Though there is a stealth continent, there is sort of the islands where you could sort of have other things coming from.
Yeah, that's true.
But I remember what the other thing was. Is I think there are certain kinds of mistakes that are justifiable because they're genre related. So like, if there's something that is just it just is in like every kung fu movie, no matter what era it's set in. I think that's okay if you're doing like a kung fu setting and you want to, you know what I mean? Like, sometimes those sort of things are fine.
Yeah. In fact, there was one that came up, and this makes me think of two things. I'll say the first one. The first one was the whole messages sent by birds thing, because I asked you about this, and like this one was really like bothered me because especially as I got toward the end of the novel, I was really trying to maintain as much accuracy as I could. And toward the end of the novel, there's a situation where people are split up across the continent, and I was having trouble trying to decide how they would communicate. And I did a lot of research into the whole bird messenger thing, and from all the research I could find in both Chinese and English, and is that birds weren't used to send messages until at least the Mongol period. And so I was really struggling with that. And then you were just like, oh, it's a fantasy setting and kung fu movies all have them, so I think it's okay. And I was like, all right.
I feel like every single wuxia television series I've seen, like, relies on bird messengers to a ridiculously accurate degree, and so I think it's safe territory. I mean, I'm not 100% sure that I've seen birds in like earlier eras, but I'm like 99% sure
Right.
that in shows set in earlier eras I've seen them like that. Um,
That brings up an interesting topic that, I mean, you could probably do a whole, podcast or just on this one topic, which is how the Kung Fu and Wuxia novels and movies and stuff, how they sort of affect our perception of reality, especially historical reality. And again, you're absolutely right. They're fantasy, they're fictional settings. But I think number one is you always have to ask yourself the question of how much were the creators of whatever TV show, movie that you're watching, how much were they concerned with historical accuracy? My guess would be probably not very much, especially if it's a Chinese production. I think that for the most part, especially the entertainment stuff, I really don't think that many of the directors are focusing hugely on historical accuracy. And then, of course, the whole martial arts plays a big part of it too. I've been reading this book. It's called Chinese Martial Arts. Excuse me, by Peter. I think his name is pronounced Lorgi, but is it Lorgi or Lorge or Lorg? I don't know how to pronounce his name.
I'm not sure either, but I had the same question.
Yeah. I hope he doesn't listen to this and get offended. But basically, that really has been sort of mind blowing to me. I mean, I always knew that things in the movies and stuff are not real. Not. I obviously know that, but I think a lot of our perception of the whole martial arts stuff is affected by how, and by we, I just mean fans of the genre, are affected by all the movies and things we've seen. Whereas reality was a very different thing, both in terms of the historical stuff like the birds, or just the mere fact that the whole thing about Shaolin being the center of martial arts is very historically like not very solid until way later in history. So I think there's a lot of things like that. And sorry, I'm kind of rambling here, but the third, I thought of a third point which also comes into it, which is how the translation comes across. And that has a huge effect on how English speakers view it, because a lot of your perception of the world that's being built is dependent on the translation, and that can play a really big role in it as well.
That is a huge. Well, I got a couple of points on this one. The first one is that I feel like sort of torn on that topic, because on the one hand, I like the world that's created in these movies when they just kind of have fun with the history. They don't sweat it too much. On the other hand, I want to be careful to understand that is like not always 100% accurate. You don't want to get like, you sort of see the same thing in fantasy and science fiction, where if you're somebody who gets all your information about the Middle Ages from fantasy, or all your information about science from science fiction, you can end up with some really strange ideas. So I think it's like that. But also on the point that you just raised, when it comes to things like institutions, that's a huge issue that I've encountered, where I've been like, it's like, if they decide to call somebody king versus call him governor versus call, because the subs and the dubs on these things can be all over the map, and they could even have like really anachronistic titles, like they might call a guy like a cop, or when it's like a little bit of a more nuanced position that he's holding in society. So yeah, I think that's definitely. but then I guess I don't know how you like, short of learning the language, I don't know, like, because there's only so much information they can convey to you on that, uh, on the subs and on the dubs, and so
Yeah,
you know,
I mean that's one of the reasons why I've done why I'm doing what I'm doing on my YouTube channel is I'm trying to get as much sort of like accurate, relatively accurate information there for people to have access to, and like the subtitle and dubbing situation is can be very problematic because I mean, there's many problems. One of the problems being that sometimes the translator's attitude is that, oh, this is stuff that Western audience either A wouldn't be interested in or B wouldn't understand, so they decide, oh, we just won't translate it. Like literally, they'll just leave stuff out because they think it's not important. And then there's the whole like, obviously, you only have a limited space with the subtitles. I mean, people can't read, they can only read so quickly, so you can't include every single little aspect and you can't include footnotes and stuff. One of the things that really struck me recently was when I went back to watch Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which I mentioned this in another of the videos, and it really just blew my mind that some of the most important, I mean, I had heard this before, but to see it with my own eyes, how some of the most important plot points don't come across in the subtitles, I find is pretty shocking because like that's considered one of the, I mean, it won an Oscar, right?
well, it was like a U.S. Chinese production, right? Like, wasn't it like
Yeah,
a? So you would
and
think that they would have, yeah,
I've heard. I mean, it's reported that the director edited the subtitles, which, if that's true, I'm even more mind blown because there's stuff that is completely missed. Like the point that I brought up in one of my videos was how um, there's information about the Green Destiny sword and stuff that is completely left out in the subtitles that makes the entire plot make sense. Because in the movie where the girl who in the subtitles is called Jen, I think,
yeah,
she
yeah.
goes to steal the Green Destiny sword, and they never explain why she does it. It makes it just seem like she just kind of wants the sword because it's cool or something. But the whole reason why she did it was because she was studying the Wudang martial arts, and Michelle Yeoh's character mentions to her that the only way to truly understand the Wudang fighting is to use the Green Destiny sword. And in that moment, you see the girl's eyes light up, and then the next scene, she steals the sword. So it sets the framework for the entire plot, but they don't mention that in the subtitles.
Okay, all right, that's interesting. It's been a couple of years, I think, since I've seen that last. So now are there? Do you know if there are different versions of the subs out there, or is it still like the same subs
Not,
that were in the
uh,
theater when we first saw it?
I mean, maybe a fan has. I really don't think anybody has gone back to fan sub it. And I remember that line, that scene from the first time I saw the movie and the subsequent times that I watched it over the years. And it's been a few years since I watched it, but when I went to find that scene, the subtitles were exactly how I remember.
Hmm.
If you go and watch my video on swords and sabers, I have it re-subtitled correctly, and in the original subtitles, basically. Jen, the girl, says to Michelle Yeoh's character, she's like, "Oh, you're a fighter, right?" And in the subtitles, Michelle Yeoh's character basically says, "Yes, but I prefer the machete," she calls it, or the saber. And then she says some moves are just appropriate for the sword, or something like that. That was it. And so I went back to find that clip for the video because I was talking about the differences between swords and sabers. And then as I was listening to the Chinese, I was like, "Wait a second, that's not what she says." And yeah, she specifically references the Wudang martial arts and the Green Destiny sword. And then considering that Jen is studying that, but remember the whole reason she was upset with her own master was because she was studying these Wudang martial arts that her master had stolen. And Jen was really talented with martial arts and had actually surpassed her master's ability already, and yet knew that she couldn't use them to their full extent and didn't know why, and was upset with her master because her master didn't even know why. And then she thought that the reason that she was missing all that was because she was missing the sword, which is why she stole it. So
There was a movie I saw last week called Jade Dagger Ninja. And it's also there's another version of it called Shaolin Fox Conspiracy, and it's based on a Gulong story, and it's I can't what's the name, the character with the four eyebrows. I can't remember his name, but it's one of those.
Is Liu Xiaofeng?
I think that's it. I think that's who it was. But so, what do you think when they when they're doing a dub and they change it, but they do it to like they're having fun? Like so in this one, right? There was I watched the subs and I watched the dub version. In the sub version, he's fighting these four guys, and I forget what they're called in the subs, but he beats them and he says like, "Oh, you said that you're invincible. You know, I see no evidence of that," or something to that effect. But in the dub version, I think they called themselves the Four Kings, and he says, "Oh, Four Kings, no Four King good." So there was some pun on on the Four King, and but see, but I enjoyed myself a lot more on
Right.
the
I
dub.
think, I mean, like when it comes to humor, I'm very open to being flexible. When I do translations, I definitely cater to the like. So I was talking with the author of the books that I translate, and he actually proactively, or I don't know what the right word is. I didn't mention what I felt about it. He basically echoed my own sentiments, which was he said that the point of his writing is to elicit emotions from the audience basically, and that should be the main goal. It's hard to say with the scene you're talking about. I wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if in the Chinese he makes some pun or joke about it, and so maybe they try to carry that across. And I definitely do that. Like one perfect example is in the novel I translated, I Shall Still the Heavens. There's this carrot. Sorry, not a carrot. There's a character who's a parrot, and the character has a few catchphrases, and one of the catchphrases in Chinese is actually he says "your sister" a lot. But the thing is, that's actually pretty vulgar in Chinese, and it's also very funny. So the way I translated it is I would have him say "bitch" instead of "your sister,"
Okay.
and it added a level of humor because he would use it. He'd be like, "I'll take you down, bitch," and it sounds like pretty like kind of
Yeah.
funny and like a little bit vulgar in English as well. But if I had translated it directly as "your sister," I feel like it loses a lot of it. So yeah, I'm definitely open to being flexible, especially when it comes to the humor.
Okay. Yeah. No, I was wondering about that. And the thing is, because the subs could have been just as inaccurate, so I didn't really know which one had better grounding in the original. Usually the subs seem to, but on humor, I was like, well, I don't know. But I really doubtful that no forking good translate directly into the Chinese. That
Trying to think. Oh, well, okay, yeah, I don't want to guess because I mean, the first thing that jumps to mind to me is something. I mean, Four Kings actually sounds, depending on how you said it, could actually sound very close to the word for death. So I can see like a lot of easy puns to come out of that. I mean, puns are so easy in Chinese, and it's so hard to translate them that I can see the translators, trying to tweak it a bit.
Well, and they come. I mean, they obviously come up a lot in the movies, and there'll be moments where you're like I know that there's like a pun thing going on with the names or something, but like it's not coming across to me. Whatever, and I mean it'll happen like six times in a single movie. Like you just, you know, and but some of them it seems like they're able to do it, and some of them they're just able to at least let you know that that's happening somehow. But
Right.
um,
It's a little easier when we're translating fiction, but when you're doing a movie, I can imagine it being even more difficult to have that come across.
okay, yeah, no, uh, I think that definitely makes sense. But yeah, I don't know what what was it I wanted to ask you. Uh, oh, what's your just like I don't know like do you feel like now that you've been living there and all like is that uh like has that affected like when you first set out to do this right like I mean you you know like where did you expect this was going to lead and like how do you know what I mean like
Yeah, I know what you mean, and I mean, don't forget that I got into translating originally as a hobby to improve my Chinese, and I was already here in China before I even started doing that. So it's not like I moved to China to like do research for my translating or something. But it definitely helps. I would say it doesn't help much in terms of the historical stuff. The average Chinese person, in my opinion, probably doesn't know. In fact, I probably know a lot more about Chinese history and stuff than the average Chinese person because of all the research I've done. Even just like I've tried to have a few conversations with my father-in-law, my brother-in-law about certain historical things. And the thing is, like, they don't really know. They know what they've seen in movies and stuff
Hmm.
like that, but they don't know the historical, details. But in terms of culture, living here has helped tremendously. In Legends of Ogre I tried to keep it mostly culturally relevant, but I did veer off in a few directions intentionally, because it's very hard to capture some things, like especially how forms of address and things like that. Also, it's extremely common in Chinese to refer to yourself in the third person, and you see that a lot in translations. I think that but I didn't do that. I didn't have the characters constantly addressing each other in a certain way, and I didn't have them referring to themselves in the third person in a different way. So in terms of the way that the characters in Legends of Overgate talk to each other, I feel like it's actually not super accurate in terms of how it would be. But I intentionally did that because I wanted to focus more on developing their characters' personalities and having that reflect in their language. Anyway, the point is just being here in China and being around that constantly definitely helped. And I think that this is one place where Legends of Orgate has an advantage over some of the other wuxia and xianxia related fiction that people put out. Because I noticed this so there's a book called Unsold by Will White, and I would definitely recommend it to anybody who hasn't read it. He's a Western writer, and he has original fiction that is based in a fictional fantasy Asian inspired world. So it's not supposed to be China or anything like that. Um, and it's really well written and it's fun and stuff. So I definitely recommend it. But the thing that jumped out to me immediately when I started reading it is that it did not seem at all like China.
Okay.
I think a lot of Western writers tend to do that because China is so different, and so there's so many things about it that are not like Western culture that they tend to try to make their Asian inspired and wuxia inspired and Sansa inspired fiction more Western like to me. So I feel like Legends of Orgate I feel like is pretty culturally accurate in terms of how the characters act and respond to different things, and that's one advantage it has.
Okay. Okay. Is there like a specific thing that you find like people tend to do when they're like I don't know like a trap that you can fall into if you're not aware that it's that there's
Well, I don't know if there's any if I could put it into a sentence or two, but um, I sort of touch on this in the video that I did on Face, which is a lot of times the things that come across as being silly in Chinese stories and fiction and stuff, a lot of times they're actually not silly. They're real. But Western people tend like especially the things to do with face and I remember when I was reading specifically it was Smiling Proud Wanderer, I think, the fan translation of that. I remember a scene where there were these Shaolin monks who at the time I was thinking they were just acting so unrealistically because of the face situation that was involved in their fighting and stuff. And but later I came to realize that it wasn't really that unrealistic after all. And so I think that's one trap. And but it's hard to understand those things without doing a lot of digging into Chinese culture. And I think being a part of it really is something that helps a lot.
okay. Yeah, I would imagine. I mean, I mean, again, I think the movies are often the only window that we have,
Yeah,
if we're in the
movies are
states.
good. I mean, if you pay close attention, then it'll help a lot. Like here's an example. One thing I remember talking to you about when I was part of the Sunday Wandering Heroes of
Mm.
Ogre campaign was it was very fun and very cool, but I totally felt like I was just with a bunch of Americans, like like
Yeah.
it didn't feel at all like I was in an Asian world,
Yeah.
which is fine. It was totally fun, but like I remember, for example, the characters would be like, the players would say, "Okay, I walk into the inn and I say, buy a round of drinks for everybody," and like it that kind of stuff doesn't happen in in especially in wuxia kung
Well,
fu
and I remember
settings.
that one because you pointed that out to people. That was one where you took a
Yeah,
moment and you explained to people why that wouldn't happen.
yeah.
Um,
I was like, "I'll buy you a drink." No, just I mean. It could happen if it in the right. But I mean, you if you watch a lot of wuxia and kung fu movies, like, did you ever see like a guy walk into the bar with his sword and like be like, "Let's have a drink together"? I mean, if you sit down at the table, you order drinks, and then you like pour a drink for the other guy, and I mean, it can happen, but just not like sidle up to the bar and be like, "Two whiskeys, please," or like it
yeah,
doesn't
no.
really.
You usually it's like, I have seen characters sit down to drink together or offer people drink, but there's always the possibility in the movies that somebody's being poisoned in those situations, kind of like you said during the game, and like in Dragon Inn, there's like a famous sort of scene like that, and you see stuff like that a lot. So I think uh, well, it's funny when it comes to gaming, it's particularly tricky because it's very dependent on what everybody who's there that's playing, like what their experience has been
Right.
with all the genre elements, with all the the historical elements. And so I found that particularly helpful having you there because you could sort of kind of point to things over time, and I don't know, it's sort of those things accrued, and
Yeah.
so I found it beneficial. But but yeah, I don't know.
There's just
Oh, go ahead.
Just I was saying there's some things that you're never going to pick up on unless I think you're in the culture. Like I wrote an Usha story, a relatively long short story years ago, probably 10 years ago or more, after I had watched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and after I had read a lot of translations. And then when I went back years later to read it again, I noticed the same thing that I just pointed out with that Will White novel. It was like cool, but it totally seemed like white guy that doesn't know much about Chinese culture but really likes it, writing a story about ancient China but not really sort of like understanding how it works.
Okay, and I mean, like, so that sounds like living there has really sort of given you a lot more insight, just from the direct experience.
I think so in terms of the culture and how people interact with each other.
And so, no, I think it comes through in the Legends of Ogregate stuff. Like, I definitely, sense that. And I feel like the times, like you were saying, where it didn't, were kind of like more like times you were sort of not choosing to do, like, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like, so, yeah, I
Yeah,
definitely think.
a lot of the conversations are definitely more but I feel like I feel like directly translating a lot of those things is can be important, but sometimes it's a disservice because I feel that the reader, like my goal as a translator, and I'm as in also in writing Legends of Overgate was, um, I would like the reader to as much as possible experience the story the way that a native speaker of that language would experience it. So that's for translating. But Legends of Orgate, to a large extent, I didn't write it in Chinese and translate it into English, but I tried to write it as though I were translating it from Chinese, not to make it sound like a
Hmm.
translation, but to be culturally accurate. And so I feel like, when Chinese people are talking to each other, it doesn't sound weird to them. So if the dialogue in the translation or the writing comes across as weird and foreign, I feel like that's a disservice. And I know a lot of people enjoy the foreign aspect and like it to be exotic and things like that. And I think that has its place. But for me, my personal preference is that they get sucked into the story the same way that a native speaker would get sucked into the story. So, a perfect example is the third person thing. Like I said, really, really common for people to use the third person. But if you throw the third person into the story all the time, then it makes them sound like they're like superhero villains or something like that.
And I guess it's a fine line too, because there's stuff that are recurring things that you might want to bring in, but you don't want it to sort of you don't want it to pull the person out of the, have the character feel, like have the character come across in a way that they're not coming across in the original language.
Yeah. And then it gets hard when those become important plot points. Like in my current translation that I'm working on now, there's a recurring joke early on in the story where the main character, who is only supposed to be in his teens, starts using a third person form of address that only somebody like a king or something would use. And it gets very hard to carry that across into the translation and have it sound natural. And at the same time, like if you leave it out, then you miss out on that entire plot point. So it can be tricky.
Sometimes I wish, like, I like history books, and history books are filled with footnotes, and I really wish that translations had way more footnotes on the page, because sometimes they'll have them in the back of the book, which is fine, but if you have it like on the actual page and you have a lot of them to explain things, I don't know, I feel like then you can get away with like, okay, this was translated for this particular reason and it works, and now I can explain it better on the, so I don't know. I just
I totally agree with you, and I'm actually gonna go back to the podcast and get this line from you and like record it and keep it on hand, because there are a lot of translators. In fact, on Wuxia World, virtually all the translators hate subtitles, and sorry, not subtitles, footnotes. And they're like really against footnotes. Like, I don't ever want to have footnotes. I hate footnotes. But I'm like, the opposite. Like you, I remember reading things like Three Kingdoms and Water Margin or Outlaws of the Marsh, and actually Smiling Proud Wanderer, the original translator Lanny Lin or Lan, he included at least 5 or 6 footnotes per chapter with cultural stuff, and I really liked that. I thought it helped a lot.
That was a fan translation, though, right? That wasn't like
yeah. There's no licensed translation of that yet.
No, I find the footnotes helpful, like really helpful. I think it was I forget the name of the book, the one about the white-haired witch. I can't recall the exact name of it, but if I remember, I think the one that I read had a bunch of footnotes, but they were super helpful. Like they were like, oh, just so you know, this is like, this is a reference to the emperor, like the, and in a lot of translations, these notes wouldn't have been there, it's useful. It's just useful to know that I need my to draw the reader's attention to something or explain something. So, but they are more work, I guess. So I don't know. Maybe that's another aspect of it. Like it does add another level of grind for the translation.
I think some translators feel that a good translation shouldn't need the footnotes. It's hard to say. I mean, if you're especially in nonfiction, nonfiction's a different story, but with fiction, I can see the point where having 5 footnotes per chapter can interrupt the process of reading. And I nowadays I do try to avoid it as much as possible, and I'll be more liberal with the translation. So, for example, perfect example is the idioms. Early in my translations, what I would do is I would like directly translate the idiom, and then I would have a footnote to explain what it meant in English. Or sometimes I would just translate it directly into English and then put a footnote to explain what the Chinese meant. And nowadays, what I tend to do is I kind of do a little bit of both. Like I'll say, like in the narrative, it'll say something like, as the ancient saying goes, and then I'll put the actual direct translation, then I'll put comma, and then I'll provide an explanation for how it pertains to the story. So that kind of gives the best of both worlds, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, I guess where I find it most frustrating when they're not present is if you have like say a monster and like the translator just okay, this is a vampire or something or whatever they translated it as, and they don't explain it. That's because then you can get stuck thinking, oh, it's just okay, vampire. All right, I know what a vampire is, and then no, it's not a vampire. It's something a little more specific than that. or just that sort of thing. And I encounter that a lot when I'm reading stuff, and so I don't know.
Same with like.
Oh, go ahead. I mean, I can sort of see the thing about a good translation shouldn't need footnotes, but also I don't think like translation's not like poetry, right? It's not like it's there's information in there that you might not like because you're making choices when you translate, and when you make a choice, something might get lost, and so I see that the footnote is like a way to salvage what would be lost, I would think.
I agree. I think that there's certain things that you cannot impart without the footnote.
Mm-hmm.
And for those, I feel like there should be footnotes. And then for the other things, I feel that the translators should do their best to carry across the meaning as much as they can without it, and then don't just let that information slip through the cracks by just saying, oh, whatever, the reader doesn't care about it. And another example is this kind of pertains to the whole subtitling and dubbing and all those different things is the way that the translator chooses to translate stuff is big. Like in this Chinese martial arts nonfiction historical book that I'm reading, he translates saber as sword, and then he translates. So if you are unsure about what I'm talking about, go look at my video on sabers and swords on YouTube. But basically, the saber is the single-edged curved blade that you see in all the kung fu movies, and then the sword is the double-edged straight gentleman's weapon, which in Ogre is the oxtail dao and the jian sword. But in this martial arts book, he translates saber as sword and then translates the jian sword as long sword.
Okay.
And the problem is when you're reading novels, that's kind of a big difference between those two weapons, as I talk about in that video. And if you don't explain which one you're talking about, it can be very confusing. And then don't even mention monsters. I mean, your example of vampires is perfect.
Well, no, I mean, I had a situation where I had a character, and I think I called him something twirling saber, and I just chose saber because it sounded better, but he was actually using a Xian sword, and I figured it wouldn't matter, but my players noticed, and one was like, hey, Brendan, not all sabers are swords, but not all swords are sabers, and so
yeah, exactly.
But yeah, so I think that's just one of those things. But yeah, so we're coming on 50 minutes. So I don't want to keep you too long. But is there anything else we didn't cover that we wanted to talk about before we?
I think we hit the main points. Me and you could probably just talk for like hours and hours about all this stuff.
So I guess we should say, Legend of Ogre is all available now. Like. That's ready to read. You dropped the chapters last week, right? So
yeah, so the whole thing is on Wuxia World, and I'm currently in the process of editing it to release it in ebook and maybe printed format. And definitely you can check it out on Wuxia World, or if you want to wait, I'm going to be tweaking and cleaning up the entire story to make it a little bit more readable, fixing some of the mistakes. So you can also wait for the officially the officially published book version if you want, or go on to Wuxia World in the originals section, I think is where it is right now.
Okay. And yeah, so again, and also what's your YouTube channel that we mentioned as well, so that
oh right, just Deathblade. You can search for Deathblade on YouTube and it should come up. The username is Deathblade.
Okay, so all right, so we're gonna let you guys go, and we'll talk to you later.